Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
You know, I was reading about World War II,
Mm-hmm.
and it really struck me how much it changed, like not just Europe and Asia,
Right.
but like indigenous communities too,
Yeah.
in the US and Canada, and not always in ways you might expect.
Absolutely. It was a real turning point.
Yeah. So we're going deep on all that today.
Okay.
This history podcast episode we found
Sure.
about how the war impacted like all these Native American and
sure.
First Nation civil rights movements. I think there are going to be some surprises.
Yeah, I think so too. I think to start, it's important to just grasp how many indigenous people were actually involved in the war effort.
Okay.
75,000 Native Americans served,
Wow.
which was a huge, huge portion of their population at the time.
75,000, that's a lot. That's really make you realize like just how invested these communities were in the war,
Yeah.
even when they were like facing discrimination back home.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about the numbers either. I mean, their contributions were really significant. Like take the code talkers, for example.
Oh, yeah.
They used indigenous languages to create codes that were unbreakable.
Oh, wow.
The Germans and Japanese were totally baffled.
Right.
They had no way to crack these languages.
Yeah, that's amazing. So these languages that were passed down like over generations,
Yeah.
they suddenly became like these vital tools of modern warfare.
Totally.
It's incredible.
It really is a remarkable story.
So did that change how people saw indigenous people back home?
To some extent, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, their wartime service, especially like these code talkers I was mentioning, it kind of helped to shift public perception.
Okay.
I mean, it did foster a sense of shared national identity.
Yeah.
And it also exposed indigenous people to new ideas about equality.
Yeah.
These ideas that were circulating during the war.
Yeah.
And a lot of them came back with a renewed sense of purpose.
Yeah.
They were ready to fight for those ideals in their own communities.
Yeah. But sadly, it didn't always work out the way they hoped, right?
No, sadly not. They faced a pretty harsh reality
Yeah.
when they got back home.
Yeah.
I mean, they came back to the same discrimination and the same control of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BIA.
Oh, the BIA. Remind me about them. Like, what did they do?
So the BIA was basically in charge of managing Native American affairs.
Yeah.
But their policies were a lot of times seen as really controlling
Okay.
and really disrespectful. They imposed all these restrictions on indigenous people.
Right.
Like, there was a ban on alcohol
I didn't know that.
on reservations.
Wow.
And that actually lasted all the way until 1953.
So it's like their service, their sacrifice, it was
Yeah.
just completely disregarded.
Yeah. I mean, there was a lot of anger and frustration about that. And the historian Donald Fixico, he described it as a long history of unfulfilled obligations.
Ooh.
It's a really powerful phrase that kind of sums up that sense of disappointment.
So all this is setting the stage for more activism, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Like one of the things I found really interesting was the Indian Claims Commission, ICC, in 1946.
Yeah.
So on the surface, this seemed like a good thing, right? The government sets up this commission, and they're going to compensate tribes for land that was taken from them.
Yeah.
They even awarded like what seemed like a lot of money,
Yeah.
around $400 million.
Yeah.
So was this a genuine attempt, like, to kind of make things right?
It's hard to say. I mean, on the surface, it did seem promising,
Yeah.
but it had its limitations.
Oh, okay.
I mean, maybe most importantly, it didn't really address the return of their land.
Right.
So it offered this financial compensation,
Yeah.
which some people saw as really not enough.
So money can't replace that connection to the land.
Exactly. I
Yeah.
mean, for a lot of indigenous communities, land isn't just like a commodity.
Right.
It's their identity. It's their spirituality.
Yeah.
It's their self-governance. So to offer money in exchange felt like a dismissal of their beliefs, really.
Yeah.
And on top of that, if they accepted the compensation, they had to give up any future claims.
So it was like a take it or leave it?
It really was.
Wow.
And a lot of people didn't like that.
That's a tough position to be in.
It is.
You offered all this money,
Yeah.
but you have to give up your right to get back what was yours in the first place.
It's a really difficult choice.
So how did indigenous communities respond to that?
Well, the reactions were mixed,
Okay.
of course.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of people saw it as like just more the same.
Yeah.
The same kind of paternalistic approach they'd always faced.
Yeah.
And there's a group called the Indigenous School of History,
Okay.
and they're particularly critical of the ICC.
Okay.
They argue that it didn't really offer any real justice. And they say, for them, land is not something you can just put a price tag on. It's much deeper than that.
Yeah. It's interesting, too, because then you have Truman coming in.
Yeah.
And he seemed to kind of continue some of Roosevelt's policies, which seemed to be more supportive of indigenous rights.
Right.
But then things took a bit of a turn.
Yeah. So the Truman administration, it's a complicated story because, the ICC seemed like a step forward.
Yeah.
But then some of his decisions were, for example, in 1950, he appointed Dylan Meyer as the commissioner of the BIA.
And wasn't that the same guy who was in charge of the Japanese internment camps?
That's right.
That's a little concerning, don't you think?
It was. It sparked a lot of concern among indigenous communities.
Yeah.
And their fears were, well, they were justified.
Okay.
Because Meyer, he was a big advocate for something called the Termination policy.
What was that?
So basically, this policy, it aimed to dismantle tribal governments.
Oh, wow.
Get rid of reservations, and encourage indigenous people to move to cities.
So assimilate.
Yeah. That was the idea. That indigenous people should just abandon their culture, their way of life.
Wow.
And just integrate into, mainstream American society.
And of course, that completely ignores
Yeah.
the significance of the land.
Huge
So
reading.
instead of making things right for past wrongs,
Right.
they were pushing for forced assimilation.
Yeah. And that consequences were, well, they were often devastating.
Yeah.
The BIA, under Meyer's leadership, they even sold Pueblo tribal land
What?
without their consent. And they forced them to move to cities
Oh, man.
with all these promises of jobs and a better life.
Yeah.
But those promises were empty.
What happened to those people?
A lot of them faced huge challenges.
Yeah.
They didn't have jobs. There was a lot of discrimination. They
Right.
felt really lost, really displaced.
Yeah.
And a lot of them ended up going back to reservations, but often in worse conditions.
That's awful. So it was just a cycle of displacement and broken promises.
Yeah. The revisionist school of history,
Okay.
they're really critical of all this.
Yeah.
They see these actions as, going backwards. Going back to the bad policies of the 19th century.
So a step backwards instead of forwards.
It really was.
It's crazy because it seems like there's a good intention,
Yeah.
but then the outcome is just...
Yeah. There can be underlying motives
Yeah.
and unintended consequences.
And it wasn't just in the U.S., right?
No, not at all. Canada was dealing with a lot of the same stuff.
Okay, so it's kind of a North America-wide problem.
It really was.
Yeah.
And to give you an idea of how bad it was in Canada, in 1945, the average lifespan of an Indigenous person was half
Wow.
that of other Canadians.
That's shocking.
It is. Infant mortality rates were really high,
Yeah.
and the government just wasn't doing enough to help.
Okay. So what kind of issues were First Nations people facing?
Well, there were a lot of problems.
Yeah.
Housing was bad. There weren't enough jobs.
Right.
Education wasn't good enough.
Right. Yeah.
And then there's the whole, the legacy of the residential schools.
Oh, yeah. Residential schools. I've heard about those.
Yeah. They were basically government-funded, church-run schools.
Okay.
And their goal was to assimilate Indigenous children.
Okay.
So they took them away from their families.
Wow.
And they forced them to give up their language, their culture, everything.
That's horrible.
It was. And the trauma from those schools, it's still felt today.
Wow. So that's a really dark chapter.
It is.
So, was anything being done to address these injustices?
Well, there were some attempts at reform.
Okay.
They weren't perfect, but they were something.
Okay.
Like in 1945, Canada moved the responsibility for Indigenous health
Okay.
from the Department of Indian Affairs to the Department of National Health and Welfare.
So was that good?
There's a group of historians, the Progressive School,
Okay.
and they see all these problems.
Like the health care and all that.
Yeah. They see that as a direct result of poverty and discrimination.
Okay.
So they argue that even though the war highlighted Indigenous contributions, the Canadian government just didn't do enough.
Okay.
Moving the healthcare, it did help a bit,
Okay.
but it wasn't enough to fix everything.
Right.
It was just too deep-rooted.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a much bigger problem.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
These issues, they were just everywhere in Canadian society.
It's so ingrained.
Yeah.
Yeah. It sounds like even with these reforms,
Yeah,
there was still a long way to go
absolutely.
in terms of, true equality for Indigenous people in Canada.
Yeah. And that's where the 1948 Special Parliamentary Committee on the Indian Act kind of comes in.
Okay.
It was formed to review that act
Okay.
and reevaluate Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples.
Okay. So this seems like a good opportunity, right?
It did. It seemed like a real chance to make things better, but it didn't really live up to its promise.
Oh, okay. What happened?
Well, I mean, they were supposed to be looking at Indigenous rights, but their
Yeah.
recommendations, they ended up reflecting a very, a Euro-Canadian point of view.
So instead of saying,
Yeah.
we need to respect your culture, your traditions, they
Yeah.
were saying you need to be more like us.
Yeah, pretty much. There's just, they ignored a lot of the
Oh.
Indigenous traditions and how they govern themselves.
Even though there were Indigenous leaders involved.
Yeah, there were some, but their voices weren't really heard.
So the committee, it didn't really change anything.
It didn't really challenge the Indian Act.
Right. It's like we keep seeing these good intentions, but
Yeah.
then they don't really understand the problem.
Yeah. It's like they're trying to fix something, but they don't get it.
They don't really see the root of it.
Exactly.
So this time period, this is where things get kind of interesting. When
Okay.
you look at it from like a historiography point of view.
Oh.
Like the way history is written and interpreted,
Yeah. Yeah. There are a lot of different schools of thought.
and they all have different views.
They do.
Okay, so break it down for me. Like, what are these different perspectives?
Well, you have the consensus school,
Okay.
and they tend to focus on, the positives.
Oh,
They see things like the ICC
yeah.
and that healthcare transfer in Canada as signs of progress.
So they see this time as like, things are getting better.
Yeah, but then their critics would say
Yeah.
they're missing the bigger picture.
Okay.
They're not seeing the problems.
Right. So then there's the revisionist school.
Yeah, and they're a lot more critical.
You're digging a little deeper.
Yeah, they're asking the tough questions.
Okay.
They're saying, maybe these measures were more about control
Okay.
than actually helping Indigenous communities.
So it's not just what happened. It's
Right.
like, why did it happen?
Exactly. And who was making those decisions?
And what were their real goals? Okay. What about the progressive school?
So the progressive school, they're really interested in the socioeconomic stuff.
So like the poverty, the discrimination.
Exactly. They argue that the government didn't invest enough
Okay.
in things like Indigenous healthcare, education, all of that.
So they're saying these problems are bigger than just a few policies.
Yeah, they were saying it's about the whole system,
Right.
a whole structure.
It's deep-rooted.
Yeah,
Okay. And then we have the Indigenous school.
right. And for them, it's about centering the Indigenous experience.
So it's not about what the government did.
Yeah,
It's about what Indigenous people went through.
exactly. It's about their agency, their resilience.
It's their story.
Yeah,
Okay, so while some are focused on policies or economics,
yeah,
the Indigenous school is focused on the people.
exactly.
We're saying, this is what we experience.
This is what we live through.
So it sounds like even though it was a tough time,
Yeah.
there was still activism happening.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you had all these veterans coming home.
Yeah.
And they were determined to make things better.
They saw what was wrong and
Yep.
they were ready to fight.
They were. And they inspired others.
It's like a chain reaction.
Yeah. And over time, their voices got louder and louder.
Yeah. And it wasn't just about change anymore. It was
Uh-huh.
about self-determination.
Exactly. It was about saying, we decide our own future.
And this was happening at the same time as all this other stuff, right? Like
Yeah.
the civil rights movement,
Yeah.
decolonization around the world.
It was a time of big changes.
So Indigenous communities were part of something much bigger.
They were. It was a global movement for justice.
And their demand, they got more specific.
They did. They wanted land rights,
Okay.
self-governance,
Right.
the right to preserve their cultures.
Not just handouts.
No, they wanted justice.
We wanted recognition.
Yeah. They wanted their rights acknowledged.
And this was different from before.
It was. It wasn't about assimilation anymore.
It was about being themselves.
Exactly.
And this had a real impact.
It did. Like, for example, in the U.S., you had the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act in 1975.
Okay.
That gave tribes a lot more control over their own lives.
Wow. So all that early activism,
Yeah.
it actually led to real change.
It did. It shows that even when things seem slow,
Yeah.
even when it's hard,
Every little bit counts.
it does. It all adds up.
And those victories, they inspired even more people.
Absolutely. It's amazing to see how Indigenous communities never gave up.
It's really inspiring.
It is.
It's a story about courage.
Yeah.
about not giving up,
Yeah.
about fighting for what's right.
Exactly. It
Yeah.
really makes you think all these like interconnected struggles and everything.
Yeah, it's humbling for sure. We've been talking about the U.S. and Canada,
Right.
but what about other places with indigenous populations?
Yeah.
How did they fare during and after the war?
That's a really good question. I mean, the impact wasn't limited to North America, you know.
Right, right. Like I know Australia, for example, they have a very long history
Yeah.
with their Aboriginal population. Were they involved in the war at all?
Oh yeah, for sure. Aboriginal Australians served in the armed forces.
Okay.
And unfortunately, they often faced like the same kind of discrimination and prejudice
Yeah.
that we've been talking about.
It's everywhere, this pattern.
It sadly, it was,
Like so ingrained.
it is. But, you know, even with all that, indigenous communities all over the world, they showed incredible resilience.
Yeah.
They never gave up.
So where can our listener go if they want to learn more about all this, about these global experiences?
Oh, there are tons of resources.
Okay.
Like there are some great books and documentaries out there
Yeah.
that really get into the specifics of, you know, different countries and their indigenous populations. Like, for example, The Fatal Shore. That's a really good one. If you're interested in Australia,
Yeah.
it's by Robert Hughes, and it's a deep dive into their colonial history
Okay.
and how Aboriginal people were treated.
And what about organizations that are like sharing indigenous voices?
Yeah, there are a lot of great organizations doing really important work.
Okay.
One that comes to mind is Cultural Survival.
Okay.
They're an international NGO, and
Yeah.
they're all about advocating for indigenous rights
Okay.
and supporting like their self-determination. And their website is amazing.
Oh, cool.
It's full of information about indigenous communities from all over the world.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. And, you know, don't forget about the indigenous people in your own community.
Right.
If you have the opportunity to, like, listen to them, learn from them,
Yeah.
it's really valuable. Go to events,
Yeah.
visit cultural centers, just, you know, have conversations. It's all about building understanding.
Yeah, for sure. This whole deep dive has really been eye-opening for me.
too.
It's like there's just so much to learn
There is.
about this history
Yeah.
and about these ongoing struggles.
It's a journey.
It is. It's a journey.
And we're all on it together.
Yeah. And these communities, they're so courageous.
They are.
They're so resilient.
They've been through so much.
And they just keep going.
It's truly inspiring.
Their stories are so important. We have to keep listening.
I do.
We have to keep learning.
Absolutely.
And, their fight for justice.
Yeah.
It's a fight for all of us.
It is. It's about creating a better world for everyone.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been great talking about all this with you.
Yeah, me too. And thank you, listener, for being here.
We hope you learned something
Yeah, we hope you'll keep learning.
and keep exploring.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.